In this clip, we're going to be learning about blend modes. To access your blend modes, we're going to be in this section right here on the timeline. You can see where it says mode here at the top. Now, if yours doesn't say mode there, you may need to come down to this button at the bottom where it says toggle switches / modes. If you're in switches mode, then it's going to show you the shy, motion blur, that kind of thing. And you'll just need to toggle over to the modes. Now, if you still are not seeing it, maybe your window is too small, you may need to right click on this bar here. Let me pull this up for you so you can see it. There we go. Modes, you'll want that to be checked on. Let's start talking about blend modes in the context of our orange solid. So this background here right now is just a little bit transparent. We have this at 60%. So this is relevant to the first few blend modes that we'll be discussing. I'll click this drop down where it says normal, and we'll look at the first section of blend modes, which is the normal category. The options, obviously, are normal, dissolve, and dancing dissolve. So the way that this works is that obviously with normal, the color of a pixel isn't going to be affected by the underlying pixel unless, of course, you have something happening with your opacity where you can kind of see through it. So normal is pretty typical in terms of it's just a very smooth looking transition from the color to the background. With dissolve, we have more of this speckled look where it's just little pixels that are being knocked out instead of a smooth transition. The difference with dancing dissolve is that you're going to have more movement if we key this opacity over time. Whereas with just regular dissolve, those pixels are just filling in and we don't get movement over time of which ones are being filled in. So that's the normal category, pretty standard. You may not see dissolve or dancing dissolve used very often just for the fact that they are pretty obvious what effect is happening. And if you want to go for something more customized, you may need to choose a different mode. But they do have their place in very specific instances. Let's move on to our next category, which is the subtractive category. That's going to be this one right here where we see darken, multiply, color burn, classic color burn, linear burn, and darker color. These blending modes tend to darken colors, some by mixing colors in much the same way mixing colored pigments work with paint. So even though we're working in an RGB color space, which is by default an additive color, darken is going to work more like if we mixed paint. So for instance, when I click darken, we're going to see kind of this green color happening because we're mixing the orange and blue together, and that's going to create this green. Now, if I choose something like multiply, this is going to be a really popular effect. It's a little bit harder to see what is actually happening with this opacity turned down to 66%, so I'll increase that to 100. With this at 100, you can see that the lighter pixels, where some of the brighter parts of the clouds in the background are the ones where we're seeing the most orange happen. So the orange takes kind of this wash effect over the lighter areas, and then the darker areas are not affected. So multiply is going to be something you want to use when you want to give sort of a cast of a color over the top of another photograph. You'll see multiply used quite often. Then you're going to have some other choices that you can cycle through here for these other options within the subtractive category. Let's move on to the additive category. Our options include add, lighten, screen, color dodge, classic color dodge, linear dodge, and lighter color. These blending modes tend to lighten colors, some by mixing colors in much the same way you would when you mix projected light. So with additive color space, we're going to see all the colors coming together to create white instead of all the colors coming together to create like a black or muddy color like you do in colored pigments, like when you're mixing paint. So with add, we're going to see those light areas become almost completely white. It's like a light yellow color with this orange. And then the darker colors are where we get the color wash effect, like what we were talking about with multiply. So the darker areas of your photo take on the most saturated part of the color that you're putting over it. And then these other areas become a little desaturated, but we still do get some color combination. Now, this additive color mode is great for if you're trying to add in some reflections in post, or possibly if you want to add something like dust over the top of something. So if you have maybe some dust that you've photographed or you found a picture and it has a black background and then the little white flecks of dust on top, you can put this over the top of some footage, set it to add or screen, which is going to have a really similar effect, and you're going to get this look like dust was on your photograph. So it's a great way to add kind of a grunge to something. These additive color modes are really good for adding those types of effects. Now the next category we have is the complex category: overlay, soft light, hard light, linear light, vivid light, pin light, and hard mix. Overlay you're going to see used a lot. It looks somewhat similar to what we got with multiply. I want to show you a comparison of the two. So multiply is going to have a much darker effect, and overlay is a similar effect, but we get more of a dynamic range. So we have lighter areas and maintain those really dark areas, whereas multiply kind of takes away from some of the really light areas. So that's a good way to remember them in your mind. If you need more contrast overall, go with overlay instead of multiply. Now, a lot of these other options you may not use very often, but soft light is one that I want to take a moment to point out. Similarly to the way I was describing how you could use add or screen when you're creating some sort of a dust or grunge effect on footage, soft light is great to use whenever you're creating a dark vignette around footage. So whenever you create a dark vignette kind of around the corners of footage, like you would maybe up here, if you have a light area of the footage that happens to overlap with a corner, you're going to have that vignette not look realistic, because the vignette doesn't usually have a cast over the lighter areas. It's more apparent in the dark areas. So if you create your vignette, instead of just maybe turning down the opacity or just feathering it, also change the blend mode to soft light. And then you're going to have this great effect where it's not as visible over the top of the light areas of your footage, and it's as visible as you need it to be in the dark areas. So you'll get a much more realistic vignette effect by using soft light in this situation. Now let's talk about our difference category. So that's going to be this category right here. Your options include difference, classic difference, exclusion, subtract, and divide. These blending modes create colors based on the differences between the values of the source color and underlying color. Now, these might be a little bit harder to conceptualize what that color is, but it's great if you're looking for kind of a abstract. Now, the next category is the HSL category. The options include hue, saturation, color, and luminosity. These blending modes transfer one or more of the components of the HSL representation of color, which is hue, saturation, and luminosity, from the underlying color to the result color. So for instance, let me go ahead and choose the luminosity value. What happens here is that we take kind of this general luminous value from behind and bring it forward. And you can see if I zoom in, some areas are more gray and some are more blue. So this is a very subtle effect, but we're not getting much of an interaction in terms of being able to see through this image. It's taking a different part of that image's data and using it to transform the combination here. And you can see that color actually has a really pretty effect. It's similar, again, to overlay and multiply. However, color is giving us the most saturated form of all of these, and we still get the dynamic range that we talked about with overlay for the most part, where we have some really light lights and really dark areas. The last category is our matte category, and all of these have similar applications in that they work the same way you would use mattes for achieving some sort of an alpha'd out look. So if we need to use, let's say, that bar in and of itself as a way to cut out that picture, it doesn't really matter what the color of it is. It's more talking about where is that color and how can we use it as some sort of a mask. And there's other ways to achieve this too. There's lots that we're going to learn about in our next module. So I don't want to go too deep into the weeds on what the stencil and silhouette blend modes work as. Now we have one final category here, which is the utility category, and it has the alpha add and luminescent premol options. So this is going to composite your layers normally, but add complementary alpha channels to create a seamless area of transparency. This is going to be useful for removing visible edges from two alpha channels that are inverted relative to each other from the alpha channel edges of two touching layers that are being animated. Now, I know that sounds maybe kind of complicated or confusing if you're just now learning about all of these. These are going to have some really specific utility functions. The luminescent premol is going to prevent clipping of color values that exceed the alpha channel value after compositing by adding them to the composition. So that's useful for compositing rendered lenses or light effects like a lens flare. And that's going to be whenever you're using it from footage with pre-multiplied alpha channels. So again, two really specific modes that we're not really going to get into in this course. These matte modes, however, are going to be really useful in our next module. So the last thing I want to leave you with is if you're in a situation where you're just looking at all of these and you're really overwhelmed, you don't know which one you want to use, you can simply select one of them. And then while you've got that category selected like this, now I can just hold Shift and hit the plus button on my keyboard, and I can cycle through every single thing in that list. Now, if I get to the end of the list, I can start hitting the minus or subtract button, and I can go the other direction. So you can see I'm just going kind of forwards and backwards through that list. And this is a good way, if you're really not sure what look you're going for, to quickly find something that you're happy with in the context of your composition. So let's go ahead and move on to our next clip where we'll summarize what we've learned in this module.